Hi everyone, I'm Frida. I'm running the Gemeinschaft. Welcome to the next talk of das Symposium. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, which is cheese, and I'm super happy that Jason Hinds is here with us. And maybe you can wave really quickly so people can identify who you are, who don't know you. And we're going to talk about why it's important to save British cheeses and how you guys are doing it. Jason, you are the sales director and the joint owner of Neals Yard Dairy. For those of you guys who don't know, who are maybe not as deep in the cheese business, Neals Yard Dairy has 3 cheese shops in London and a wholesale business for the UK and also worldwide, I think since the 1980s. And we're definitely one of the biggest influences to revive artisanal farmhouse cheeses and make them accessible and popular again. And we're a really big influence in that up until today. And I mean, who can better explain it than you, Jason? Maybe could you give us a short introduction on yourself and also explain what Neals Yard does and how it also evolved since the beginning, since you guys started, and tell us a little bit also about the relationship that you have with the cheesemakers and with your customers.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you all, those that I can see. One I know already. Hi, Ursula. I just briefly talk about Neals Yard Dairy and how it evolved and came to be what it is. You know, what inspired it to become, and then how it evolved from there, and then a little bit about how I got involved with it. So, Neals Yard Dairy. Those of you that know it will know it as you said, a cheese shop and a wholesaler. But in actual fact, Neals Yard Dairy began as a transformer of milk into dairy products and cheeses. So we were actually a maker, not a monger. So we had a micro dairy in central London that was established in the middle of 1999 by the founder and my business partner, Neal's, one of my business partners, Randolph Hodgson. And he and a group of like-minded hippies who colonized an abandoned Victorian warehouse just near an abandoned wholesale produce market in an area of London called Covent Garden, which at that point was abandoned. They created a series of businesses all under the Neals Yard name, because that was the name of the physical yard where they were. And there was a bakery. There was the Neals Yard Whole Food Warehouse. So they were some of the pioneers in organic food and natural food. And there was also a place that developed natural remedies, homeopathic, and so on. And so this was a very alternative area, and really very far ahead of its time in 1979. Neals Yard Dairy was a place where milk was formed into dairy products, creme fraiche, yogurt, ice cream, fromage frais, and some cheeses. So we began actually as a dairy. And it was only about a year into the business, in 1980, that Randolph became interested in visiting another community of like-minded young and alternative people who were colonizing the southwest of England and were inspired to make continental style recipes, so soft cheeses, blue cheeses, rather than the cheeses that were native to the United Kingdom. And that group have been referred to since as the new wave of cheesemakers. So that was 79, 80, 81. So Randolph had a lot in common with those people just because he was interested in cheese, and also they were, there was kind of a hippie thing to it as well. So that, the Neals Yard crew was, and all these new wave cheesemakers were all pretty, left of center in their terms of their thinking and just their outlook on life generally, quite alternative. And so he went to go and visit them, made cheese with some of these people, and they didn't really have anywhere to sell their cheese other than a little shop in Totnes or just from where they were making it. There wasn't really any demand. And so he had a venue in central London, and so he decided that he would bring these cheeses back and sell them alongside the cheese that was being produced in the little micro dairy that he was running. And so that really set the tone for the business that we've become today. And there are a couple of really sort of seminal moments at that point in our history that have really kind of led us to become the business that we've become. And the two that were taken from those early interactions with the cheesemakers were, first, Randolph, who was he was a product of he did a food science degree in the late 1970s when you were being taught, the kinds of things you learnt were how to get more water into a chicken and bulk it up. And, it wasn't, maybe the most inspiring degree that he took. But what he had learnt really at university was that actually the goal was to standardize food and make everything taste the same, was basically what he was taught. And so to arrive in a cheese making store, or say in a cheese store, and see with this one particular cheesemaker, Hilary Charnley, it was the first place he visited. The cheese isn't made anymore, but it was called Devon Garland. He was struck by how different the cheeses could be from one day. The cheeses that were made on different days, how much they might vary in look and in taste. Because ostensibly they were the same thing. He figured that, they should all be the same, but they were not. And when he tasted them, he realized that this was a kind of this was a seminal moment because it defied what he'd been taught. He tasted through them with Hilary. They discussed how the cheeses tasted. So there was a lot of engagement between the two of them about how and why these changes might be. And then he decided to select out the cheeses that he liked the taste of, and then brought them back to the shop. So this set in motion, a behavior that we continue to this day, where we visit cheesemakers very regularly, in some cases once a month, and taste through their stock and select out the cheeses that we want to bring into our business. The second important moment in our history was that when he brought these cheeses back to our shop, the public that he was introducing the cheeses to had no knowledge of any of these cheeses. They were unknown to the London market, and most British cheeses were unknown, perversely, to most British consumers. The British consumer at that time would have been weaned on Gruyere and Brie and Roquefort, but not so much raw milk farm cheeses made in the southwest, that's for sure. And so he just decided that he would give tastes. The discussion that he'd had with the cheesemaker around how the cheeses were tasting, he decided to have a similar engagement with the customers that came into the shop, because he thought he liked them. He thought they were good, but he didn't know. So he thought it would be good just to see what the customers thought. And actually, this was, you'd have to understand that at this time, nearly all food in the UK was bought in supermarkets. There was no grocers, there was no food specialists, there was no engagement with the consumer. So
I was just about to say that. I mean, the general picture of British food cultures, I wouldn't say the best, at least in Europe or the world. I mean, it's always lamb chops and mint sauce. But like, how is the food culture evolved in general, and has it changed in any way between your selling staff and the customer? Do you see that the education that you also do in the shops is fruitful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's kind of interesting about what happened with our business and our tasting culture, what we're seeing now is that it's over the course of the time that we've done it, it's inspired a lot of other businesses to also mimic that. Why? Because people realize that the consumers are interested in engaging with the food that they're about to buy, want to understand whether it's something that they want. They might not know they might not know about Devon Garland, and how will they find out other than by tasting it whether they like it or not? So why not work that out before they buy it? So I think but also it's a moment of engagement and taste, and it's just a moment that people enjoy. And I think that it's an experience, and I think that to bring that sort of experiential element to food buying is fun. People like it, but it's also important because the cheeses change all the time. So if someone came, if you came into our shop and bought, I don't know, Montgomery's cheddar or Havant cheddar 3 weeks ago, and you came in today, you will be buying a piece from a different cheese from a different batch made on a different day, and it will be different. It'll be good, hopefully, because it's been graded and selected, but it will be different. And so it's important to understand, and for the consumer to be reassured that they are going to get something. Or the monger might say, you know what, you bought the Harvard last time, it was really, really good, but there's this incredible batch right now of Lincolnshire Poacher that we're selling. Why don't you try that? And then there's a discussion around that. So it creates there's a dynamism about the whole moment of engaging and talking, engaging and discussing around a taste, which I think is part of the experience that brings people back in time and again. And it's interesting that we've sold cheeses into our biggest export market. Fastest growing export market is France, and we've had more and more of the customers that we work with actually incorporate more tasting in their selling style, because actually most French cheese shops, there's no tasting whatsoever. It's very rare, because it's assumed that the customer knows the customer knows the cheese, but there's no kind of understanding that the cheese changes. So it is interesting to see those kind of established those established routines being challenged. And I think it was easy.
And also the established taste being challenged, no? Because I mean, if you say, okay, industrialized cheese before was the most, like, the farmhouse cheeses wasn't bought that much at the beginning, and you really needed to educate the customer first. It's not just about making it accessible, but also explaining to people, okay, that's what maybe cheddar actually tastes like, instead of a cheddar block that doesn't taste like anything.
Well, exactly, because if you gave them a taste of cheddar that was like a Montgomery's cheddar and they only knew block, they'd say that isn't cheddar. But in fact, they don't realize they're tasting the real cheddar. But the only way to persuade them is to give them something that tastes good. And then they'll say, wow, that's good. What's that? And you say, well, that's real cheddar. Really? And so then a conversation begins. So I think that and it was kind of easy in a way to do that in the late 70s and early 80s in the UK, because, as you said, British gastronomy had more or less been wiped off the face. And I think in a way, if you have a blank slate like that, you don't have people, to make these kinds of fundamental changes in the way people engage with food in a country where there are established ways and means of doing things are already set. It's difficult to make those changes because we don't do it like that. If you said to a French chef, or if you look at the London food scene in the early 90s and a restaurant like St. John, they were able or even someone like Heston Blumenthal. If you said to Heston Blumenthal, look, or if you went to a French, get a very established French chef who's had all this training, and have him or her do the kind of off the wall stuff that's been done at the Fat Duck that Heston Blumenthal has done, people would say, well, you can't do things like that. That's not traditional. This isn't the way that we work. But if you've got a blank slate and you can start from zero. It's much easier to make these kinds of changes. So I think we've been in a period in Britain in gastronomic, just in terms of, you know, the recent gastronomic history, where it's quite easy to make some of these kinds of changes because anything goes. You can do whatever you want, and if you're, you know, if there's no one to challenge you, or you know, there's no precedent to follow, you can blaze your own trail. It makes change much easier to happen.
Can you explain a little bit more about the other side of the educational part, kind of? So the partnerships that you have with cheesemakers, because I also can imagine if you started with a blank slate and there were maybe not so many cheesemakers, and maybe some already also just started making cheeses. How exactly does a partnership look like, and how do you exchange also maybe about the cheeses? Do you give them do you give them recommendations, for example, on aging? Because I think it's actually really interesting, and it could be applied also for here in the area around Berlin. There's a lot of people that already make good cheeses, but I think there's way more potential if there would be more, you know, collaboration also between gastronomes and cheesemakers and maybe the farmers. Can you give us a little overview on how you handle that?
It's really difficult because you have to be a bit of a chameleon, because you're engaging with people and everyone's different. Some people like feedback, some people hate feedback, some people are sensitive, some people are less sensitive. So and I think it's also, you know, you're walking on a tightrope if you say, I think you should do it like this, because actually you can set yourself up for all kinds of problems if you say, well, no, you know, I think if you come, let's say you end up buying a cheese from a cheesemaker, and then you go back to them and say, well, you know, there's this problem or that problem, and then they'll say, well, you told me to do it like that. You know, you have to be careful. But I think what you can do as a cheesemonger and as a wholesaler is, I think your due, you know, one of the most important one of the most important things that you can bring to the relationship is feedback from the coalface, from the marketplace. And one of the reasons why I firmly believe that you know, we saw the kind of destruction of our farmhouse cheese industry post-war was because cheesemakers evolved their cheeses and their cheese quality according to the feedback they got from the market. But the market in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were the supermarket buyers, not the consumers. So the market required, so the market was asking, or the customer was a different customer, say, in the earlier part of the 20th century than the later part of the 20th century, because in the early part of the 20th century, it was the person going to the shop buying the cheese, and there's lots of small independent shops, and everyone was tasting cheese together, and there was a direct feedback loop right there. But then as supermarkets took over, the requirements became less and less centered around quality and taste, and much more centered around other elements that were important to the buyer, who was not the consumer, but was the buyer, was the supermarket buyer, such as, what's it cost? How easy is it to cut? What does the package look like? You know, how will it be shipped to me? How many can you get on a pallet? All these kinds of things were the primary, you know, these were some of the driving things that were important in how the cheese should be. So the cheesemaker is going to respond to feedback on what the market wants, right? But if a supermarket buyer has got different, you know, if quality and taste is, you know, fifth or sixth down the list in terms of importance of things that are important to them as a buyer, then the cheesemaker will evolve their recipe according to those requirements, because that's the customer, right? And so if you're a cheddar maker and you have to make a cheddar that's easy to cut into blocks, then you'll make a cheddar that's softer and less friable. But that's not necessarily how cheddar was made 100 years ago, right? And so you'll evolve your recipe to make it into squares, to wrap it in plastic so that it loses no weight, so that it's easy for the cutting lines to cut it into smaller squares. And so that's how you would evolve your recipe. So the recipe is evolved according, the cheesemaker will evolve the recipe according to what the buyer is telling the cheesemaker. What happened when Randolph started visiting cheesemakers in the early 80s, he only had one requirement, which is how does it taste? And that was the one thing that drove us in our buying, because we were then going to taste it to a customer, and invariably, whether they were learned about the cheese or not, funnily enough, because quality is like this, it's very Darwinian, the best cheese sells. And so, we have really based our feedback to producers on, right, this cheese sold really, we bought this batch from you last month. It was made on the, it was made on the 3rd of November 2019. Guess what? Exactly a year ago. Now, what was it about that cheese that was that made it how it was? Because that cheese was really well received, and we sold a lot of it. And then there's a discussion around that. So I think that what Randolph set in train, set in motion, probably initially unwittingly, was that by having a shop and by visiting the farm, he closed the feedback loop, and he brought feedback from consumers directly to the cheesemaker, and then there could be a dialogue which brought meaningful feedback to the cheesemaker about which cheese tasted good and why, which was a completely different set of directives to those that cheesemakers, I think, mostly had received for the previous generation or two. And so now, and the other important thing about that, there wasn't a lot of discussion around price. In fact, it could be argued that one of the things that, Randolph has done is he's helped to reestablish a bigger buffer between conventionally made cheese and high quality cheese, because there needs to be a premium for premium quality. And I think that I would still argue that much of the cheese that is sold is too cheap, and many of the consumers' perceptions about what cheese should cost is out of whack, given what work goes into it. When you compare the differential between, some wines, very high quality wines, and some, more, day-to-day wines, you can still see substantial differences in premium, which is justified. Those differences don't exist in the cheese world as much as they should. That will change over time. But I think one of the ways that you can help to encourage you can encourage cheesemakers into cheese production is to show them that they're making a premium, a value-added product, attracts a premium, which gives them a viable business. I think that's the difference between then when we began and where we are now, is that much of the new wave of cheesemakers that we started talking about, those people were doing this as a lifestyle, and it was a hobby. To see it really as a viable business opportunity was not so much. But now I think the idea of, establishing a 10, 15 or 20 ton business, 20 tons a year, the market is there, and the understanding is there from the consumer to understand that this product, if it's well made and has good taste, is worth paying for.
Yeah, for sure. So you did all of this work so far. What was the plan for the next years, and what was the impact that now the pandemic had on the producers and on your business?
Well, I think where we are we've been in business for 41 years, and the way we're structuring our business is for it to go on, for another 41 and beyond. We have other partners that'll be coming. I think there'll be other generations younger than me. I've been there nearly 30 years, that will hopefully come in and take the business on from those of us that are in charge of it now. And I'm very encouraged, because I think the industry is in a much, much stronger place now than it was when I started in the early 90s, and certainly when Randolph started in the late 70s, when it was a disaster. So, if I look forward, for the next 20 years, I actually see very exciting times ahead because we have young people that not only see cheesemongering or cheese making as a career, it's a viable career. Financially, you're not going to get rich doing those things, but you can definitely see it as something that you might do for your life. That was never a consideration when I had the idea to go get involved in this business. Most people just fall into it. You don't decide to become a cheesemonger. You need a job and you kind of fall into it. But I think over the course of time, in the next generation, I think this is definitely changing. People see it as a career option. And in fact, we've been talking a lot to Slow Food about the creation. It would have been launched this year if not for the pandemic. The creation of a master's in cheese. A place where people can go and learn about cheese making. They can learn about cheese maturing. They can learn about cheesemongering. And I think that this next generation can really see that they can have a career in it, and that's really exciting. We have a shortage. We have a shortage of good cheese. There are opportunities. There's a chap who worked in our shop in Borough, managing it for about 12 years, who's just set himself up as a cheesemaker. His cheese launched in the last 2 weeks. It's a blue cheese. It's delicious. We have a shortage of good blue cheese in the UK. So cheesemakers might come to us and say, I want to make cheese. And then we'll say, well, these are the things these are the gaps that we see in the market, and we might help them with it. That's an incredibly dynamic thing, because demand is driving opportunity, and shortage of supply is driving opportunity. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing that I think is really, really motivating is the fact that, and some of our work in the next phase, I think, is going to be trying to understand where the good milk is. Small dairy herds are, probably, people who are just producing liquid milk are some of the those are the more endangered ones, because the milk price as it is across Europe is very, very low. And the viability of producing milk just to sell liquid is it's very sketchy. It's very dubious. However, if you consider that lots of these young entrepreneurs who want to go into cheese making are not going to be setting up farms. Farms are expensive to buy, and dairy operations are expensive and complicated things to equip, and it's a different specialization. But I can see in this next phase between 2020 and say 2040, a lot of opportunity to matchmake small dairy farms producing brilliant milk and matchmake them with young would-be cheesemaking entrepreneurs. So where I'm speaking to you from now, I live in a little village in the Cotswolds, about 100 miles from London, and I match-made the local farm here, which has got some of the best milk in the country. They wanted to add a premium to their milk because they deserve it, because it's incredible milk, but they don't know how to add that value because they can't make cheese. So I've introduced them to David Jowett, who's a young cheesemaker. And now what's great about it is each party has what the other needs. The farmer has got the milk, the farmer has got the buildings usually, but the entrepreneur doesn't have money, doesn't have buildings, and is not running a dairy herd. But they do have the energy and the expertise to transform that milk into a value-added product, cheese. So by putting them together, each has what the other needs. So what's happening here on the farm in Chedworth is that, David will pay a significant premium per litre for the milk that he's using and transforming into cheese, but he's also occupying some buildings that exist on the farm. And it's a win-win situation, because the dairy farmer all of a sudden is going from a break-even to a profit-making liquid milk business. So I'm really excited about that, because I can see opportunities for saving and preserving some of the best milk before it disappears. And introducing someone who will transform that into a good quality value-added product, which is cheese, Because clearly, if the milk disappears, the good milk disappears, you can't make great cheese with crap milk. You know, that goes without saying. So I think that that next phase, our work will go beyond. I mean, you know, there are others in the business who are doing even more work than this on me. A lot working with the producers, and you know, it's as well as understanding what cheese we want to bring into the business by visiting our the cheesemakers that we work with, selecting the cheese. So next week rather, I go to Montgomery's, I go and visit Westcombe, I taste all the cheeses that they will have made in December of last year, and we'll grade out the ones that we want to buy that we'll probably sell in you know, in the next 2 to 3 months. So that work goes on. That's working, just supplying the needs of our business in the next phase. But then there's another layer now, which I think perhaps we weren't working on to quite the same degree 5 ago, which is trying to understand our requirements of the future, not just our requirements, but the requirements of the industry for other retailers and other wholesalers alike in the UK, and creating opportunity to make the industry stronger, and presenting, you know, opportunities for young entrepreneurs who want to make cheese. But also, we're also seeing, you know, young entrepreneurs who want to go and open cheese shops. So we're doing joint ventures. We're opening a cheese shop in Oxford. We opened one 3 years ago, but we're opening a second one in Oxford. We opened one in Manchester in the middle of the pandemic in April with an ex-employee. So again, with young entrepreneur, well, it didn't have to be young. Chris actually is my age, but he wanted to open a cheese shop, so we paired up with him. So I think opportunities to kind of make the market stronger, whether it's retail or whether it's production. You know, I can see a very, very dynamic and interesting phase in the next 10 to 20 years on both the production end and on the kind of retail end. And they feed each other, they work together. The symbiosis, like I said before, is fundamental.
Ursula has a question. Ursula, do you want to ask it directly? Wait, you have to unmute yourself.
First or second one? Which one do you want first?
Maybe not the second one first, and then later we ask the first one.
So I think it would be good to have, if you could give us an idea about where your cheeses mostly sell nowadays, and how important London is nowadays, because you know, London and Berlin there are slight differences.
So hang on. So the question is, where is our cheese sold? That's the first question. So you know, we sell, obviously we have 3 shops, but we sell really mainly into specialist retail shops, not exclusively cheesemongers. You know, there's a lot of you know, quite interesting dynamic grocers that are popping up, not just in London now, all around the UK. So we sell to one supermarket, that's Whole Foods, but that's not really a typical supermarket, even though it is now by Amazon. But so, you know, I would say the bulk, about half of our cheese is sold through those specialist shops, and the other half is sold, you know, on cheese boards and through food service, through restaurants mainly.
And how much UK and how much export?
We sell, so our business sells about 600 tons of cheese. About just over, before the pandemic, just over 80% of that was wholesale, large pieces of cheese, wholesale UK and export, of which probably about 60% was UK and the balance was export. And you know, and then within the UK amount, I would say about 60% of that's through food service and 40% of that's through retail. Us selling to retail shops. This is outside of our own shops. Since the pandemic, that has changed pretty dramatically. So now, you know, if you consider that our, let's call them B2B channels, were just over 80%. And our B2C channels were, you know, well, let's call it 80-20, more or less. Now our B2B channels are about just under 70%, and our B2C, so business to consumer, so that's in selling in our own shops, or on e-commerce. That's now gone up to about sort of 32-33%. So there's been a big sort of double-digit shift towards selling more directly to consumers, which I'm really happy about.
Good. Thank you.
I'd like honestly, I'd like to have that. I'd like to move that closer to 50-50 if I can. And in the next 10 years, that's going to be my intention. We are looking to open maybe another 1 or 2 shops in London, and do 1 or 2 joint ventures with other partners in shops, that we have more investment in other parts of the UK with ex-employees or with would-be cheesemongers, and also the whole e-commerce thing is something that has occupied me almost entirely since the middle of March, and is something that is becoming very interesting.
Jason, can you give a little bit more of an insight of how the pandemic has affected the producers, and how you changed as a business?
Sure. I mean, obviously the pandemic, I don't know if anyone on this call has seen probably the most dynamic, one of the best dramas I've seen for a few years is a drama on HBO called Chernobyl. Has anyone seen that? No, maybe not.
I haven't.
It's unbelievable. You have to watch it. It's an incredible drama. Anyway, the irony was that on Friday the 13th, which is, Friday the 13th in England's bad luck. And so Friday the 13th, we were getting lots of calls from restaurants worried that something was happening and that there might be some sort of big government announcement and that restaurants would be shutting. On Monday, they all started shutting, and in 48 hours, they were all shut. And so for the cheesemakers, this was a very, very, very difficult time because no one bought anything and they had very, very large building up. We weren't buying anything. We had our own large stocks. As I rang around and spoke to the cheesemakers and also spoke to other wholesalers around the UK that I'm friendly with, it was clear that this problem was big, much bigger than the one that we had in our own store, but we had our own problems in our own stores, our own mountains of cheese to move. And so, but for the cheesemakers, it was worse, I think, because not only did they have mountains of cheese that they were looking at in their stores, they also had no contact. Cheese making is a lonely business. It can be. You're often, you don't see a lot of people often if you're on a farmhouse cheese business, and your only contact with the outside world is with your customers. And if your customers don't call up for 2 weeks, you have no contact with the outside world. And for a lot of cheesemakers, this was a very harrowing time. And so, talking to them, I spoke to all of our cheesemakers in that period. Everyone spoke to everyone. And it was clear that something, we needed to do something extraordinary, to just act. So we have a really dynamic team, and we started to think really, out of the box about how we could, sell to the retail shops that we sell to, and thinking of the other initiatives, different ways. Obviously, discounting is one way, but what other things could we do? But it was clear that the problem that the cheesemakers had was much bigger than the problem that Neals Yard Dairy had, and that was a big problem. But they had their other wholesalers that were not buying. So it was clear to me that with a large portion of the B2B channels closed, the only way really to salvage the situation was to engage the B2C channel, the consumer, engage with the consumer, but they needed to be engaged very quickly because already some of these cheeses that were overstocked were getting close to their shelf, the end of their shelf lives. And so my idea was to contact Jamie Oliver, who's a friend of mine, and I just said, look, this is a big problem, and you're the only one that I know that can help reach people and help sell this cheese, and we have to do it in the next 2 weeks. So he, God bless him, he really like he pulled all the stops out. And so we were able to move about 14 tons of cheese through small boxes to support 9 of the cheesemakers that had the largest stocks of cheese that needed to be sold. And so 3 boxes, 3 cheeses in each box, 1 box every 2 weeks. So in a month from that call, well, 5 weeks from that first call, which I think was at the end of March, we'd sold 14,000 boxes, which was 14 tons. So that saved a lot of cheese from being thrown away. And it just created an energy. It wasn't so much that the cheese was sold. I think for the cheesemakers, many of them, it was the kind of the affirmation that people felt that their cheese and their business was important, that they cared. That was the biggest thing about that initiative, was that there was an outpouring of support from the British public. Well, actually, from public all over the world. It's just the British public were the only ones that could buy the cheese because we couldn't get it abroad. But there was thousands of comments on Jamie's stream, just wanting to help. And so the impact that had on the mood of our cheesemakers was unbelievable. And just for the farmhouse cheese industry at large, it was just a really powerful moment. And it had a much bigger effect than just moving 14 tons of cheese, because even even supermarkets wanted to help. Everyone wanted to help. So the kind of the ripple effect through the market was much bigger than that. So it really did help to save a lot of very, very good quality cheese from going to waste. But the longer term impact on that, and how it's made me think about our work, future, and how we've kind of, I think we've got it wrong. We've had it wrong all the time. And when I look at how much positive feedback came, talking to Jamie's head of social media and looking at all of the feedback, it became very clear that literally thousands of people didn't realize how good cheese can taste. To me, that was mind-blowing, because there's all these people that don't have access to great cheese because they buy where they buy, and they're maybe not very experienced in cheese generally, but yet they loved it. And it was made easy for them. We didn't give them a choice. We just said, here's a landing page, here's the link, here's the landing page, buy this. And it made me realize that in our rarefied, specialized world, we can kind of overcomplicate things. And if we have a sort of rarefied approach to our communication, and we're preaching to the converted, as we have done as a business for years, for decades, that's great. But if we also want to kind of like convert those that want to be converted, we maybe have a different approach. So I'm really excited about the fact that what this experience has made me realize, that there's a lot more people out there who really want to eat good cheese. They just don't know how to go about it. So if we make, go on.
What's the biggest what's the biggest learning that you have, and did the pandemic change anything on a long term, as you say, in your business, that you're gonna adapt? Or
well, it's made me realize that in a way there's something very holistic about this, because when I started talking, I was talking to you guys about how when we bought the cheese, we didn't know much about it as retailers, or we weren't cheesemongers. We just kind of had tasted. We came across these cheeses that we didn't know about. We brought them to a shop, and we tasted them with other customers who didn't know about them, and we learnt about them together. And then they bought some cheese, right? That's how it began in 1980, right? Now, in a way, 40 years later, we come full circle, and the same thing is true. We have all these customers out there. They really want to know about cheese. They really want to eat really good cheese. They just don't know how to go about it. So that's our mission. That's what we need to do. That's what we have to understand, how we can do that, so that we can introduce consumers who really want to buy great cheese because they don't know that it's what we learned is that we as a business sent out, over the course of this last 6 months, we've sent out cheese boxes to 20,000 people for the first time. And like 6,000 of those people are reordered, and most of those people didn't know about our business beforehand, and didn't know about these cheeses, and they're so positive about them. And so what we need to understand is how can we be better at communicating why they should buy these cheeses, and how do we make it easy for them? How do we, what's the approach? If you go to a place with many, it's a bit like I remember going to a restaurant, I think with my first girlfriend when I was about 17, and a restaurant was a terrifying place because I'd always gone with my parents before. So they did the menu and they ordered the wine and stuff. And then, so that was a terrifying moment going as an adult, having to look at this menu with all these options, right? What wine do you, I mean, Christ, it's terrifying. So it's a bit like that, and after a while, the more you do it, the more familiar you become, the more confident you become, the more you know. But in a way, if we want to help the industry, we want to help inspire other young people to go into cheese making, then we need to create the market. We need to inspire. We need to open this world out to this whole layer of customers who want to buy the cheese. Like they just don't know that they want to buy the cheese, or they now do know. And how can we tap into that, more effectively through our communication? Don't have them land on a website and then give them many choices. I mean, what is a territorial cheese? How do I know which cheddar I should have? No, what we have to do is we have to make it simple, I think, for that group. I think for the group that we already speak to, that's fine. We can continue doing what we're doing. It's just having a different level of service. You can have an a la carte and you can have a set menu, and you need a different approach, and the menu is different, right? So I think if we develop a sort of set menu approach for engaging with those consumers, then I think we can open up this world. We can take them through the looking glass and we can introduce them to great cheese. Not just British cheese from anywhere, but we need to take them by the hand and take them through that door. And then once they're through the door, then you've created the momentum, and then they'll start working out with themselves. They'll move from set menu to a la carte. But
Right.
that opportunity is big, and I think that's what I'm, personally, I'm really excited about it, because it's helped to clarify in my mind that is going to be a really central part of our work, is how we engage more fully with the consumer directly, which is, as I said, coming back kind of to where the business began 40 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I would love in the last 10-15 minutes to open up to all the other questions that we have. There's some already lining up. Andreas, do you want to also ask your question directly if you unmute yourself? Let's try this. Hello?
Who are we talking to?
Yeah, Andreas, but he unmuted himself, but I can't hear him. Okay, I'm just going to read the question.
Sure.
Regarding the feedback to the cheesemakers, do they sell cheese at their production site? Otherwise, I would see feedback potential to get direct feedback from the consumers there.
Yeah.
And he says this is exactly what I see missing here in Germany with small cheese producers and farms.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andreas. And I think that, yes, some do. There's a couple of caveats to. I think it's great if the cheesemakers can sell from the farm, if they have the time and the expertise and the inclination to do it. If they don't bother, because it can be a big distraction, and really we want them to make good cheese. But if they have the capacity to do that, we have one or two cheesemakers who do a great job at that. And I think it's great. The consumers love to go to the source. The one thing I would say, and if you have a chance in Germany to start establishing that from a blank slate position, thing that I would say from the learning that I would take from what we've done here, that I think is fundamentally important. The wine world has understood the importance of this, and I think it needs to be included in the way, cheese is sold to the consumer, and that is cheesemakers who sell from the farm gate need to understand what the value is of the product that they make, what the value proposition is. So what I mean by that is, if you're making a cheddar, say, and that cheddar sells in the marketplace at, say, £30 a kilo, more or less, somewhere between 26 and £30 a kilo, depending on which route it's taken to get to market, depending on the wholesaler. If it's come to us, it's going to cost more money to get it to the counter because we run around the countryside and so on. And another one picking up the phone and, we'll have a different, they're not maturing, whatever. So there'll be a difference, but the bandwidth, the range of price needs to be consistent. So that the consumer understands what the value of that cheese is. Okay, so it's broadly in and around €30 a kilo, say. Okay, if the cheesemaker sells the cheese from their farm gate at the same price that they wholesale to, let's say the cheesemaker, for example, sells me the cheese at £12 a kilo, and our retail shop sells it for, say, £26 a kilo. But the cheesemaker sells to the consumer at the farm gate at the same price that he or she would sell to me, £12 a kilo. That is bad news. That is destructive, because it undermines and undervalues the product. So all I would say is, if the cheesemaker is going to sell from the farm gate, respect the value proposition, given all the work they put into the cheese. Respect the work that's done by the wholesalers and the retailers, and understand what the more or less benchmark what your cheese should be sold at the retail point, and sell it for more or less that, maybe a little bit less because it is from the farm gate. But in the wine world, in France, for example, they've understood that. So if you go to the chateau and you buy a particular bottle of wine at source, it won't be that much different in price than if you bought it from a wine specialist in Paris or somewhere else locally. It'll be broadly the same price. And it's very important that if you do sell from the farm gate, I believe, that you respect what the value proposition of your cheese is, and not undermine the other partners that you have. But also, don't, if one of the cheddar makers that I buy from is selling from his farm gate, the raw milk farmhouse cheddar made with his own milk, and it's cheaper than what a consumer can buy a block cheddar for in a supermarket, that is confusing. So I think that if that is to be, so I think what I'm saying is, yes, it's a good thing. I think it's great for consumers to go to farms and see what's going on, and see that there is real people making real cheese with real milk from real cows. But if it's a real distraction, and they can't do it well, don't bother doing it. And if they are going to do it, make sure that they respect the value chain.
Yeah. Ursula, I think if you want to ask your academy question now, but just tapping into the question that Jason just answered, do you have any view on the German cheesemaker market and direct sales? Do you have any experience with that? And can maybe... You're on mute again. Sorry.
Germany is quite different with the UK in that respect. We have a real lack of the kind of cheese Jason is talking about in that quality segment. And that's also why I would like to ask you another question, Jason, because you were mentioning that master in cheese making, your plans for that, which I think is super welcome. And I would like to know, where do you see the Academy of Cheese and the School of Artisan Food in that respect?
Well, I think the Academy of Cheese is a great initiative. I think that in the same way that it's great, to take consumers, e-com consumers or just consumers that are new to cheese, and find a way of introducing the cheese to them online and making it easy for them to understand, and give them pairing suggestions and recipes and all of that, which we do in the boxes, just to kind of break the barriers down. The cheese is doing that too, and has got a series of different levels that they are working on to introduce the world of cheese to people who want to go into, they're helping to sort of precipitate the idea, to sort of perpetuate the idea, I should say, that cheese can be a career. Cheese is something that there's a lot to learn, but I love the idea that there's level one, which is the basic entry level, but then there's going to be 3 more levels. I think they're working on the level 2 is already out. Level 3 I think they're working on, and I think we are talking to them about maybe getting involved in some of these higher levels, maybe 3 and 4, possibly introducing a level of maybe we will get involved at the affinage stage, and maybe there'll be some some engagement there, and maybe some maybe we'll get involved in some of the teaching. So I think it's a great thing. I think that if for example that supermarkets that are inclined to sell cheese are inclined to sell some people that are working for them to maybe do a level 1, and they come out learning more than they did before, and they understand the difference between a farmhouse cheese and a block cheddar or whatever, that's a great thing. And I think
for the school of artisan food, Jason, which is much more hands-on, and people like Mike Thompson went through there, and do you see, like, does that?
Yeah, I think all of the one of the problems is that if you want to learn about cheese, where the hell do you go? And so if the School of Artisan Food at Welbeck is an amazing thing. I mean, the cheese course unfortunately didn't last very long, not the year-long one anyway. Which Mike did, which was a great thing, and David, who's in the village, also did the same thing, and that inspired him to get into cheese making.
But why didn't it last, the cheese course?
Sorry?
Why didn't it last, the cheese course?
I think because it was a big commitment of a year, and I don't think they got enough people to sign up, and I think that it was ahead of its time, if I'm honest. I think if they'd gone for maybe if they'd gone for cheese courses that were shorter in length, shorter duration, with lower cost, and then built it up, I think they would have done better that way. I think to go straight in with a commitment of a year from Cole, when nobody even knew you could learn about making cheese, I think that I honestly think it was ahead of its time. I mean, it's produced 2 or 3 really good cheesemakers, but I wonder how many more we might have got if perhaps there was a 2 levels of course, maybe more of an entry, like the Academy of Cheese is doing. Like, there's an entry level, there's levels 1, 2, 3, and I think possibly if that had been the approach,
like WSET in one.
Yeah. I think they would have had a much greater chance of succeeding, and who knows, maybe they will go back to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I would say there's another question from Birgit. Birgit, do you want to ask directly? You also need to unmute yourself.
Oh, no. You can listen?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm to you? Okay.
Hi.
My question was, you talk about the box cheese when the breakdown, the corona breakdown was, so there were very short time to act.
Yes.
I wonder how you did it, how to activate people to buy the box, to know about the box, and so is or was Jamie Olivier enough as an VIP, or what did you do?
Well, I mean, I needed to have. I mean, he's a friend. I've known him for a long time, and he's also very generous with his time, and he also has, I don't know, 8 million followers or something. So he's also very good at presenting. I mean, he is passionate, right? So it was fortunate that I gave him a script, he delivered it, and it was impassioned. and it was enough because, you know, in, I think, within 3 hours, we had sold 4,000 boxes, and that was all we had. We ran out. So, so I think that was enough to just, but so it was a question of really needing to act very quickly, thinking about how do we solve this problem, being fortunate enough to know somebody who was sympathetic, who knows some of the cheesemakers, who loves British cheese, who has always used them. You know, in his restaurants, he's worked with us and worked with these cheesemakers. He uses them in his cooking, and is passionate about it, and also is very good in front of a camera. So we were very fortunate that it was the right person at the right time with the right, you know, willing to help. I mean, you know, he's given a lot of his time, and I mean, he doesn't charge anything for it. I mean, I give him a box of cheese every time. That's it, you know. So yeah, but that was enough. That was enough to solve that short-term problem. But the most important thing was the knock-on effect, because it created an energy with a much more tsunami-like effect, so that other people did their own initiatives, and many other cheesemakers that we didn't put in the box also had a lot of support from the public, local, you know, public who've got cheesemakers in their local area. They went to go and support their cheesemakers, bought on the farm. So it created a much bigger, you know, knock-on effect.
Looking at the time, I would just go over one last question
Sure.
from Carla. Carla, I'm just going to read it if you don't mind. How are the new food policy regulations in the UK, in brackets Brexit, are going to impact cheese making in the future?
Okay.
You skipped that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually a bad question. I mean, it's a good question. It's a bad situation.
Yeah.
And actually, Jamie's the one who's working more on the food standards than anybody else. He's the one who's challenging the government. He's the one that's taking them to task. He's the one that's created the petition that lots of us have signed. It's a real concern for that, you know, that food standards risk, you know, they risk being, you know, we risk having our food standards lowered in the coming you know, months and years. I don't fear for the cheesemakers that we work with and their standards dropping, but I do fear that, you know, standards at the kind of entry level, you know, the more mass produced level of cheese production could be affected, because they're going to have to fight with cheaper, much more mass-produced imports from the likes of America. And the frustrating thing about that is that that's what the problem was 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, British cheddar makers had to compete with cheaper imports coming from Canada and America and Australia, where mechanization was much more advanced. And so that was the beginning of the end of specialist cheese production in the UK, was the imports of large scale, cheaper, mass produced cheese from America. And you can kind of see this coming maybe round again. What I don't think it will affect the cheesemakers that we work with, but I do fear that it might affect some of the kind of larger scale cheese producers that will all of a sudden have to fight on price against you know, less regulated, cheaper imports from outside of the EU, and you know, probably where welfare and standards are much lower. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that the prices are going to be lower. And I do fear for that. Brexit, I'll tell you in 2 weeks. I mean, you know, it's such a depressing story, and it's been going on for so long. But you know, but we will have some. I only hope that there is an outbreak of common sense, and that you know, and that we can, you know, you know, our leaders can work out some sort of deal. But whatever the case, it's going to affect our export businesses into the European Union, because deal or no deal, there's going to be more paperwork and complication and cost. So I'm apprehensive about that, but keen just to get on with it, because this has been going on for so long, and the uncertainty is just it's damaging for business. So I'd like to just crack on with it, and I hope that the leaders just see good sense and work out a deal so we can continue to trade as we should. And I hope they. What I fear though is on the kind of welfare and food standards. I'm afraid that the politicians are going to prioritize a trade deal with the Americas over food standards, and but the election that's happening today will have a big bearing on what direction that goes in. So these are some very big days. The next 2 weeks are some of the most important that are coming up, because what happens tonight who wins tonight will have a bearing on that question about standards, and also a question on what type of Brexit we get, what type of deal we get, what kind of solution we have with Ireland. There's so many things. It's it's unbelievable that everything's coming at once.
Yeah, and second lockdown also coming at once. So
just for fun, yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to close. Sorry, Konstantin, I saw that you have another question. Unfortunately, we have a next talk lining up. So I feel like we do need to speak with you again. There's lots to talk about.
No problem.
Exactly. Also, if anyone is going to London after Corona, I guess, visit Neals Yard Dairy. Exactly, in the future, visit Neals Yard Dairy. Thank you, Jason, so much for all the time. We will share all of the links and more information on British cheeses, on Neals Yard Dairy, in the event app that you guys all have. And there will be a resource list where you can read also some podcasts that Jason recorded that are really cool, and some links.
The only other thing I'd just chuck in, we didn't have a chance to put it up, but I know that Carla was ready with it. But we're launching on our website maybe tomorrow or the day after a really dynamic set of resources on new cheeses, on all our cheeses. This is the page that I'm talking about, and if you scroll down a little bit, this is a kind of very comprehensive set of information on all the cheeses that we work with, from well, I'm calling it the DNA of all of these cheeses, and there's you can click to learn more. I hope that people who want to learn about these cheeses, learn about British cheese, will be able to kind of go through the looking glass and keep on discovering. There's films, there's quite a lot of, it's a pretty it's basically an amalgamation, a lot of the information that we've collected about a lot of the cheeses and cheesemakers that we work with over the course of the last 40 years. We've finally be able to bring into this sort of constellation of pages. These will be going live on our site. I think Claire's putting them up tomorrow or by the end of the week anyway. So if you're interested, and if it's good lockdown fodder. If you've got time on your hands and you've got time to scroll, this would be as good a place as any to do it.
Learning about cheeses, I feel like that's a good thing to do during lockdown. So there's lots to learn, and thank you so much for the time. I hope we speak soon, and we're gonna continue at 7:30, so in 20 minutes, with Krishan Duray, and talk about migration and food culture. So that's going to be also really interesting, and maybe also talk a little bit about cheese. I'm going to sneak the topic in, and I wish you all a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for your time.
Bye, Jason.
Okay. Bye. Hello to everybody.
Take care. I will do.